Today, let's talk about squash, melons, and cucumbers, which all belong to the same family, cucurbits. I'm gonna go over how to sow, grow, train, prune, maintain, stave off diseases, and more for this wonderful family of plants that everyone loves to grow all summer long. Step one to success is how do you actually start your plants? Well, you basically have two options. One is direct sowing, which we'll talk about next, or you start them in a seed tray and transplant them out into the garden. Now, quick caveat about starting them in seed trays, you can actually start them off in something as small as the 6 cells, but the idea is that once they actually sprout and emerge, you want to transplant them pretty quickly. You can wait for their true leaves to emerge, but after that point, you really don't want to wait around any longer. You want to either pot them up or put them in the ground because there's just not enough soil in those containers for something as vigorous as these plants. Now, my preferred method is to actually start them in 4 cells because they have plenty of soil, which makes it easy to water. It also gives them plenty of nutrients to get their growth going quick because these guys grow fast, especially in the middle of summer. Now, I will say that later we will be transplanting these 2 Chardonnay melons and this Janoski watermelon. And as you can see here, this is just a 3-inch 4 cell, and they've carried for quite a while in such a small container. Now, I wouldn't recommend waiting this long. These were kind of forgotten seedlings, but they'll do just fine once transplanted. So now, let's transition over to an in-ground section where I'll show you what happens when you direct sow your squash, melons, or cucumbers. So here's a direct sow example. This is duriani squash. I put 2 in the ground at the exact same time that I put 2 in each one of these cells on the 4 cell. These came up 2 days before these, and they already have their first true leaves. Why is that? Well, this is a gigantic block of soil. It's the earth. So there's a lot more potential, there's a lot more heat, there's a lot more stability in the soil that allows that squash to kind of pop up sooner. The advantage of doing it in ground is that it grows a little bit faster, not by much, but what I'm noticing here is that one of the leaves got entirely chewed off, and that's why I put 2, because when you grow in ground, there's always a chance that a pest can entirely take it out before it actually has a chance to grow. If a cutworm came in this particular spot and chomped the squash, I would have 0 squash. By growing them in transplant cells, I can make sure that they have like 2, 3, 4 true leaves before transplanting them in the garden, which means that they'll be more robust than any pest can handle, and they'll survive pretty much anything. Now, the other thing I really like about transplanting is that I was able to put these here because I knew that that spot was open and I knew I wanted to grow squash there. All those others in those 4 cells that you saw earlier, I don't really know where I'm gonna put them all. So if I had to actually decide where to put them all, I probably would miss the season. By putting them in 4 cells, I have the chance to kind of open up new space in my garden and pop these in when I find the right space for that particular plant. The next thing you need to know about growing these plants is how much sunlight and what is a good location for them. And that's why we're over here, because I actually made a huge mistake earlier in the season, and it's right next to me. I'm crouching down here in what is supposed to be my 3 sisters garden, which quickly turned into a 2 sisters garden. I have corn and beans growing right here, and right here is squash that was supposed to be trailing all throughout here, but I made a crucial mistake, and that is how much sunlight these plants are getting where they are. This corn grew so fast that it's actually blocking almost all the sun after about 1 o'clock from reaching the ground right here. And off to the left here, I have this Pride of Madeira, which actually blocks a lot of the early morning sun. And that means that these squash plants are only getting probably 2 to 4 hours of sunlight max. This has been in here since April, and it's basically doing absolutely nothing. So they're actually serving no purpose. There's really no reason for me to continue growing them. And that's just an important thing to remember about these guys. They make really large fruit, or they make an abundance of fruit like in cucumbers. So they need a lot of sunlight in order to do so. Make sure that when you plant these, that they're getting plenty of sun, probably at the very minimum 6, but really 8 hours of sunlight in order to produce an actual sizable harvest that's worth growing. Now we have a basic understanding of how to start these seeds and also what kind of light they need. So let's get some in the ground and get it growing. I want to plant a couple on this trellis right here that I built last year. It's going to be planted with those Chardonnay melons I showed earlier, but also show you 2 to 3 other quick options after we plant this out. But I gotta get some of these plants out of the way first. This is slightly off topic, but I figured it's a cool enough thing that you guys would want to see it. These are actually breadseed poppies, and the flowers have long gone, and what's left are their poppy seed heads. So this is actually how you get poppy seeds, like if you wanted to grow them to make your own poppy seed muffins, poppy seed bagels, things like that. So here are the poppy seed heads, and if you look at the top, there are all these openings, and that is where the seeds come out. So all that is poppy seed. Now I could either save this to plant as new seed, or I could save these to use as culinary poppy seeds, which is probably what I'm going to do just because it's going to be a fun little side thing. So here's what I've collected from that plant. Now the bed has been cleared and we could go ahead and throw these melons in. So the idea behind this sort of trellis structure is that melons take up a lot of space. they sprawl all over the place and they shoot off a lot of side vines or suckers that also take up even more space. So one of the good ways of growing them and actually getting a lot more space back in your garden is to grow them vertically. They're not heavy enough that they would break the plant. So that's why I'm choosing to put this particular melon on a trellis like this. And just to get things started, I'm gonna weave the vine through at least a couple of these fence brackets, just so it has a good starting point and it knows that that's where it's going to be living. I forgot to mention that you wanna make sure you use mulch on these guys because they will suffer from improper pollination and just weirdly shaped fruits if they don't get consistent watering early on in the period where they're actually forming and creating fruit. Later in the season, a lot of these things actually want the water to be cut back severely so they get sweeter or more rich and they store better. For example, for winter squash or for watermelon, they taste much sweeter if you stop watering in the last couple weeks. But at the beginning, 100%, you wanna make sure you're giving them adequate water, and mulch is a great way to make sure you're doing that. So one other way of growing these is to just put them in the ground somewhere where they have plenty of space to ramble. So this large bed here has kind of been designated as squash and watermelon heaven because I've just left it totally open. There's nothing else to really block it except for a couple of poppies that haven't seemed to get the message that it's fully summer now. So over here I have my kabocha squash, and it's actually already been setting some fruit. I see one fruit over here that's already sizing up quite nicely. I have some watermelon over here, another melon over here, and I plan on putting a couple more starts over here once they emerge from those 4 cells. Now keep in mind that if you do plant them in the ground, they're going to take up a lot of space. They want to send out a lot of vines, they want to ramble, because they need all that sunlight to produce these large fruit. So this is option number 2, just shove them in the ground, but make sure you have enough space. Option number 3, as you can see, I'm behind in this prison over here, and all of this is paracord that's running up along these conduits. So the squash right here, which is the center cut, which actually I see at least 6 or actually maybe 10 squash forming on it right now, are entirely supported by this string. You don't need a welded wire fence or anything like that. All you need is some strong string and somewhere to tie it off to, and the squash or the cucumber or the melons will do the rest. They have these tendrils which will wrap around, grab onto things, and that allows them to stay upright without any additional support as long as you give them something to climb on. And yet another option is to do something like this, where you have a trellis net attached to some tree stakes, a 2x2 or anything you really have handy. And this trellis net will again give them something to climb on, and that's how I've been growing my cucumbers this year. And as you can see right here, I just have a 6 or 8 foot bed with a bunch of plants that are only taking up vertical space. Otherwise, all of this would have to be on the ground, and you could quickly see how much space these plants can take up. But I just got a wonderful cucumber, and this trellis has been treating me well all season long. Here are a couple basic pruning tips for growing squash, melons, and cucumbers, starting with the melons and squash. The only thing I'll say for that is that you want to make sure you limit each one of those vines to produce maybe 3 fruit max. If you want to guarantee you'll have 2 very large, delicious ones, stick to 2 per vine. It's just a safer way to make sure that instead of getting 4 or 5 mediocre fruit, you're going to get 2 or 3 truly delicious things that you want to eat. Now, when it comes to cucumbers, they're different because you harvest them continuously, maybe every day throughout the season. So when it comes to growing these, the method that I've been sticking to this year is to try to be training my cucumbers to only have 1 vine. That is at the start. So as you can see here, this guy only really has 1 growth going all the way up. It has no offshoots or suckers or bushiness. And the idea behind this is that you're concentrating your plant to reach the top of your trellis. Once it reaches the top of its trellis, it's still producing fruit along the way, but it now has a lot of leaf matter and it has plenty of sunlight. And once it's at the top, no more pruning, let everything go wild. It's just going to be raining cucumbers all the way down until that vine hits the ground again. And you'll get so many cucumbers you won't know what to do with them. But now let's transition to problems you might face when it comes to fruit formation and pollination. Starting off with something I see right here, which has to do with improper watering. This could happen to anyone no matter how experienced they are, and that is when you reach down to harvest a cucumber and you find that one part of it is extra swollen compared to the rest. This is actually entirely to do with inconsistent watering. Sometimes it's out of your control. So take a look at this right here. This is where the cucumber started to form. It's normal size over here, it pinches down and it gets really skinny and then it gets really swollen. So what happened was that the heat came into the season just in this past week, turned on the irrigation extra heavy, and all that extra water swelled up the bottom of the cucumber. Well, this part never got plenty of water during its formation. So this is an inconsistent water problem. The way to solve it is to set a consistent irrigation schedule or mulch very deeply so that you don't get any sort of discrepancy from water when it starts to form to when it finishes forming. Now let's talk about pollination and how to step in and do it yourself manually. This is a tiny paintbrush, and what you're looking at over here or my center cut squash. Now, if you weren't familiar, there's basically two different types of flowers in the plant world. To keep it simple, there's plants that have male and female flowers, and then there's plants that have both together. Tomatoes are an example of one that have both into the same flower, so they can actually self-pollinate themselves. Now, squash has the male and female flower, so do cucumbers, watermelons, anything else. The cool thing about this method is that you don't actually need to use the male flower from the same squash. You could use it from a different volunteer squash. You just can't collect the seed and get the same fruit in the end. The difference between the male and female is that the male is just a flower, and then at the bottom is a stem. There's no actual fruit or ovary, which is true on the female flower. So here's an example of a female squash. It has the fruit. It looks just like the final fruit that you're going to harvest, and then it has the flower at the end. It's very distinctly different from the male flower, which, as you can see here, is just the stem with a flower on the end. So now let's actually go ahead and do the business for them. You have two different ways of doing this. Now, obviously, I ripped this off the plant, so this isn't going to form any fruit. So this is the male flower, this is the female. One option is that you could take this and rub it against every single part of the female flower, and now you effectively transport pollen yourself. Now, in my garden, I have so many bees and things like that I don't really need to do any manual pollination because there's plenty of pollinators around. Now, if you don't want to rip off the flower or you don't want to walk around and do that to every single one, you could just get your paintbrush, brush along the bottom. There's usually a lot of pollen, or along the actual stigma itself, and then just use your brush to transfer the pollen that way. The other cool thing is that if you have a bunch of male and female flowers not forming at the same time, which can be extremely frustrating, you could take a male flower, throw it in a Ziploc bag, keep it in the fridge for a day or two, and that pollen should still be viable. The most common and frustrating disease that can affect these plants is probably powdery mildew. It is a fungal kind of mildew spore that creates these little white dots all over your plant and suffocate those leaves from actually being able to photosynthesize. Now, a couple key ways to avoid it are, number one, don't water your plant late in the evening where the leaves will be sitting wet all throughout the night and not have a chance to dry off, because that will create a perfect environment for mildew to thrive and continue to multiply all over your plant. Number two is highly consider growing your plants vertically, because by growing them vertically, there's very little soil contact, first of all, but there's also a heck of a lot of airflow coming through the entire plant. If this was on the ground, maybe only the leaves would get a little bit of wind coming through them, but when you grow it vertically, the entire plant can get blown by wind, dries off, and kind of keeps those fungal spores more in check. But there is one other major pest that can deeply affect all these plants. That is the squash vine borer. The squash vine borer, or SVB, is a very common pest for many gardeners across the nation. Luckily, I don't have that pest in my garden, at least not yet, maybe soon, but here's what happens. It's a moth that comes over to the base of your squash plant, lays its eggs. As those eggs hatch, little larvae come out and they start boring their way into your squash stem. This kills the squash stem because it eats it out entirely, and now there's no way for water nutrients to flow up the plant. So there are a couple options once the damage has been done. You could literally perform surgery and pull that larva out and kill it. There's a lot of videos online that you could find on how to do that procedure. But the other thing you could do is, once you have actually removed that larva or solved that problem some other way, what you could do is actually create a new root system. These plants are so robust and resilient, and every single part of their stem can essentially form new roots, especially at the leaf nodes. So all you have to do, let's say that the squash vine borer damage was over here, you did surgery, you killed it, but you're still not getting enough roots to actually support your squash. Just come up further on the plant, find the stem with a leaf node, and then just bury it with soil. Over time, this will now create a new root system that'll now supersede the old one and provide nutrients to the rest of your plant. All those people who grow the giant watermelons, the giant pumpkins, they use this method across the board for every single part of their stem, because they want every single part of the stem to root into the ground so that they have a gigantic root network instead of just the main one where you planted it. This allows more water and nutrients to get to your plant to produce that bigger squash. And actually, you could just use this in general if you want your plant to be healthier and create more bigger squash, melons, and I guess cucumbers. So that is a tip on how to solve that problem. Another way is a preventative method, which is where you wrap the stem in foil. This, I guess, stops the larva from being able to penetrate into the stem and just protects it from the damage in the first place. So those are some common solutions and common problems when it comes to growing these three plants. Now, if you want to see how I built the tunnel over there, where I planted the Chardonnay squash earlier in the video, I have a full video, which I'll link right over here. And hopefully you guys picked up a couple useful tricks for growing these three amazing plants, because they're so delicious and wonderful in the garden. And if you live in a warmer zone like me, it's not too late to still put some in the ground.